Explaining the American War of Independence. In 1607, the 13 colonies were founded by the British colonial empire, and, for a long time, they were mostly left to govern themselves. However, after the 7 Years' War, the British would begin taxing the colonies, because after the war they became deeply in debt. Because of this, protests would arise all throughout the colonies due to the fact that the people inside of the colonies resented the British for not allowing them to have representation inside of the British Parliament. In 1717, colonist resistance would be met with gunfire when, during the Boston Massacre, 5 people would be killed by British soldiers. Despite the fact that the British soldiers were only defending themselves from the colonists who were throwing things such as rocks and clams at them, this only turned colonial opinion against the British even further. 3 years later, a group of people from Boston dressed up as Mohawk Americans would board a British ship and dump the tea cargo into the ocean. This event would become famous, and today it is known as the Boston Tea Party. The now outraged British Parliament would pass a series of punitive measures to re-establish their control in Massachusetts. In response, a group of colonial delegates would meet in Philadelphia to denounce taxation without representation. They would also denounce maintenance of the British Army without colonial consent. However, they would not go as far as to demand independence from the British. In April of 1775, local militiamen would clash with British soldiers in Massachusetts, starting the American War of Independence. The Second Continental Congress, the same people who had denounced the British previously, which included members such as Thomas Jefferson and Benjamin Franklin, would meet once again in Philadelphia. This time, however, they would appoint George Washington to create a Continental Army and to oversee the capture of Boston. However, American enthusiasm about the war would wane due to the dangers of the war, so the colonies would start recruiting young and poor men. They would entice them to join the army by giving them offers of cash and land. In 1778, they would even begin enlisting African American males into the army, something that the Congress had initially forbidden. Although the British won the first major battle of the war, being the Battle of Bunker Hill, this would encourage the revolutionary forces, knowing that they could hold their own against the British after they inflicted heavy casualties during the battle. By 1776, a good majority of Americans wished for independence from the British, so on July 2nd, 1776, Congress would vote for independence, and on July 4th, the decision would be ratified. On July 4th, 1776, the United States of America would become a country. Thomas Paine's pamphlet, Common Sense, was a large driving force for American independence, as it had largely boosted American want for independence. The British would then send a force of 34,000 troops to stop the Americans, and would make George Washington retreat at New York. However, George Washington would then cross the Delaware River, immortalized in a famous painting, and defeat the British in a surprise attack at the Battle of Trenton. Washington would then win another battle at Princeton, reviving the rebels' hopes of winning the war. The American army under General Gates would then go on to win the Battle of Saratoga, prompting the French to join the war on the American side. The American War of Independence had become more than just a revolution. It had become a world war, as not only France, but also Spain joined the war on the side of the colonies. Spain had joined the colonies because they were still bitter about the fact that they had lost the British at the end of the 7 Years' War and lost territory. After the British capture of Philadelphia, the Americans would greatly benefit from the training and discipline that they gained from the French army. Because of the training, they went from just a bunch of untrained revolutionaries to a real working military force. After failing to crush a rebellion in New England, the British would turn their attention to the South, and initially would win many great victories, such as their victory at the Siege of Charleston. However, in 1781, a Franco-American land and sea campaign would force the British to surrender at Yorktown. This was because the French force stopped reinforcements from helping the British, and stopped the British from retreating. The Siege of Yorktown would be the final major battle of the American War of Independence, and 2 years later, during the Treaty of Paris, the war would come to an end, and the United States' borders would be largely expanded. In conclusion, the American War of Independence was a major war for both sides fighting the war, being the British and the Americans. As for the Americans, it marked the start of their country, and for the British, it marked the first time that a colony had rebelled successfully and become its own country. This new nation would break away from the traditional monarchy and would instead elect their own leaders, their first president being George Washington. This new nation, known as the United States, would go on to become one of the most powerful nations in the world. Thank you for watching this video on the American War of Independence.